This is a little bit different than what I've been putting on this channel, but I figured the channel is still relatively new. I can experiment with different things to see how it goes, and if this goes well, then maybe I'll revisit this format in the future. If it goes exceptionally well, then maybe this will become the default format for this channel. And if it goes poorly, well, then you'll never see it again. But if it went poorly, then you probably never saw it in the first place, so there you go. I guess it's not really a problem. As you can probably tell by the title of this video, I want to take some time today to talk about single issue comics and why I am pretty much done with them, have moved on and don't really touch them. Maybe I'll pick up one that looks kind of interesting if it's a new title that I just kind of want to sample. Maybe I'll do that, but that is exceedingly rare for me to even do that. I've pretty much moved on to only consuming collected editions, and I want to talk about why that is. But before I jump into that, I do want to kind of make it clear that I don't really intend this video to be about me just ranting about my single issue issues. I mean, yes, that's going to be a lot of it, but my hope is to talk to people who are either just getting into the hobby of reading comics, people who are in a similar position to me right before I kind of stopped collecting single issue comics. And I'm also curious for people who have made the same decision that I have, kind of to hear about their experience, to share mine, and compare kind of what's similar and what's different about our journeys. I really don't want this just to be me ranting, even though it's going to be what it is. I have a bigger purpose in mind. That's what I'm trying to get to. So, a little bit of a background about my history with comics. I first started getting into them in kind of like my late high school time, right around there, 2011, 2012, somewhere in that ballpark. I was a big fan of Batman at the time. I liked a lot of the animated movies. I liked the live action movies. And actually, I think it was Under the Red Hood. I really liked that movie. And that movie was kind of like the first domino to me being like, okay, I want to actually read the source material. So of course I go online and I find out, what people say are like the go-to Batman comics, Year One, The Dark Knight Returns, things like that. I buy those online, I read them, they're great, I love them. And then I said to myself, I kind of thought to myself like, hey, I kind of like this whole graphic novel thing. There's a whole story right here in a book. I don't have to, go out and kind of put it together piecemeal. I just get this one whole collected story. It's fantastic. So I found myself at an actual comic shop. And I was looking at all the graphic novels they had. The owner was talking with me, and I said to him, like, yeah, I kind of prefer the graphic novels. I don't like the regular comics. And he said, like, well, that the graphic novels are just collections of the single issue comics, which I always sort of knew, but I don't think it ever really clicked with me that the single issues are the same stories or the same type of stories that I get to see in graphic novels, except I get to experience them as they're being published, not further down the line. So that was kind of an aha moment for me there. That combined with the fact that I'm standing in a comic shop for what I'm pretty sure was the first time, and I'm looking at this wall of graphic novels, but there's also this huge wall of single issues that all look so cool, and that was that I made the decision to start checking out some single issues. Of course, I started with Batman. It was right around the time that the New 52 had started, so I started with issue number 1 of Scott Snyder's Batman, and things just kind of kept growing from there. I ended up having a pool box at a comic store with tons of comics I was collecting every month. I was in a position where I, had a part-time job. I was in college part-time, so I was in a nice position where I had time, but also a little bit of money, so I was able to invest a lot of that in comic books, and it was great. But it just kept inflating, getting bigger and bigger, and eventually it reached a point where I was spending a lot of money on comics. I didn't have as much time because I had moved on to a full-time job, I had graduated, and eventually, probably like right around the time of the pandemic, I can't remember the exact time, I made the decision to stop collecting them, or no, I guess I stopped collecting them a little bit before that. And then right around the time of the pandemic is when I decided to sell off my collection, which at that time was, I can only estimate, well over 1,000 comics. I sold off pretty much all of those except a handful of comics like the run of Scott Snyder's Batman and New 52. Obviously, that being one of the first comics I collected, kind of had a special spot in my heart, so I held on to that. And a few other comics I just thought were really cool. I held on to those, but more or less, I got rid of my entire collection. That's more or less my journey with comics. But it doesn't really explain why I moved on from single issues. Yes, money and time were big factors, but I want to dive a little bit more into exactly how that came to be. And I think the first thing that I don't know if I really noticed at the time, but looking back, it is definitely kind of what was going on. And one of the reasons that I ended up having so many comics that I didn't have time to read, they all went into this massive backlog. The reason that that happened was the price of comics at the time. For me, and I know it's different for everyone else with their financial situation, but for me, comics were priced at kind of this dangerous point where they were enough that if you bought a good number of them, they put a sizable dent into your wallet, but they were cheap enough individually that if something looked cool and you wanted to kind of pick it up, on a whim, you could pretty easily justify that impulse purchase. $3, I guess it was like usually $3 at the time. $3 for a comic, something new, something interesting. Yeah, I can afford $3. I'll throw it that way. Oh, there's this big, event happening in the DC universe, and there's a couple tie-in comics. I don't want to miss out on those. I'll go ahead and pick them up. They're only a couple dollars a piece. There's a brand new title starting. Oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I'll pick up the first couple issues. They're only a couple dollars a piece. You can kind of see how it's easy to justify any one of those individual purchases, but together they end up being a good bit of money. And the bigger thing is you end up with a lot of comics, and for me, they ended up in a backlog that eventually I realized I was just never going to get to. So that price point of comics, which I'm sure is very strategically arrived at by the publishers, I'm sure they know this is what is happening, was a big reason that I stepped away from the single issues. It was just too easy to get sucked into things on a whim, especially for someone like me who, tends to get caught up in, I tend to get very fixated on new things, and very rarely does that actually stick. So single issues were dangerous for me in that respect. I have to believe I'm not alone in that regard, but who knows, maybe that's just me. The second major issue I ran into with single issues was space. Single issues, especially if you're buying a lot of them, very quickly end up taking a lot of room from wherever you are living or wherever you store them. And yes, you can organize them. You have these big boxes you can put them in, which I did do. I had them organized more or less by character and alphabetically, which was fine. But eventually you just need to keep getting more boxes, and they take up more space. And, then you start getting some of these weird titles that you're not really sure where to put them into your organization. And it just becomes a lot to track, and it takes up a lot of room. And my cats loved climbing up on top of my stack of boxes. But eventually that's what most of the comics were being used for. They were Mount Cat as a spot for them to take naps, and they weren't being read. Basically, they just kind of became an eyesore because I didn't really have a good spot for them. They were very much in a spot that everyone could see, and it just wasn't pretty. Now, I know that collected editions also take up a good bit of space, especially as you start to build your collection of those. But number one, that collection grows much more slowly. Unlike the single issue comics, collected editions are a little bit pricier. You can't really make an impulse purchase of those. At least I can't. I know some people probably can, but I have to really think about which one of those collected editions I actually want to buy. So the collection grows much more slowly, so you can be a little bit more strategic about how you organize it and where you put them. And also, the collected editions, since they're put together in these big books instead of these smaller individual books that all have to be in bags and boards, at least that's what I did. Even when they're in a box, to me, they still kind of felt like they were all over the place. They all felt disjointed, disconnected, because physically they were disconnected. Collected editions are at least physically all together in one single unit, which does help with the organization, and also you can very easily put them on a bookshelf where they look really nice, and you can't do that with single issues. So all of that is to say that single issues take up a lot of space, they're difficult to organize, and they quickly become overwhelming. I think I got that point across, at least I hope I did. My final issue with single issues, and this is something that I don't think is talked about a ton, but it was important to me, and one of the reasons that I think I ended up getting such a backlog, which was the very nature of how single issues are published. More or less, single issues are published on a monthly basis. Every title has one issue that comes out per month. And that makes it really tough to enjoy the story, especially for someone like me who quickly forgets story details when things are fictional. I do pretty well with nonfiction, but fictional stuff, it tends to leave me pretty quickly. So going an entire month between issues, I can forget a lot of what happened, and sometimes I wouldn't want to read the new issue because I couldn't quite remember what happened in the previous issue, and I didn't feel like going back and reading the previous issue just to move on to the next issue. Or in some cases, I'd have to go back 2 or 3 issues if there was a reference in the brand new issue to something that happened a little while ago. That just became frustrating after a while, having those gaps between it. I couldn't really enjoy stories. Because of that, I ended up with a backlog because I didn't have the motivation to keep reading something that I'd kind of forgotten in that past month. So I decided to switch over to collected editions where I can read not just part of a story, but the entirety of a story at once. And that really changed my appreciation of comics. I really liked reading them when they were single issues. It was fun. I thought the stories were great, but I really came to appreciate comic storytelling once I started focusing solely on those collected editions. I thought the stories were much more interesting, much more fulfilling to me in that format. Obviously, they're the same exact stories. It's just the way that I read them was different, and I found it to be a much more satisfying experience when the whole story was collected in one nice book, as opposed to disjointed over several months. So there you have it. There's me, kind of ranting as I promised it was going to be. But I do hope this helps some people. If you have any thoughts, please leave them in the comments, especially if you made a similar decision to me to move away from single issue comics. I'd love to hear about why you made that decision. Who knows, maybe it's the same, maybe it's different from me. I don't know, but I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I guess we'll see you next time.